April 12, 1944. Camp Swift, Texas. The train screeches to a halt under a cloudless blue sky. Dust and heat shimmer off the rails like fire. Inside the boxcars, dozens of German soldiers, young, sunburned, and silent, wait for the doors to open. They've been traveling for days from the East Coast, herded by American guards whose English they barely understand. When the locks finally snap open, a flood of light burns their eyes. Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner, 27, once a tank commander in Tunisia, blinks through the glare. He expects the worst: mockery, hunger, perhaps even violence. For months, German radio had painted the Americans as savages, cowboys with no honor, who shot prisoners or worked them to death in mines. But what he sees now doesn't fit any of that. The guards standing outside are calm, uniforms crisp, rifles slung but not raised. Behind them, rows of wooden barracks sit neatly on flat Texas ground, surrounded not by the brutality of barbed wire and machine guns, but by stretches of grass dotted with mesquite and cottonwood. The camp commandant, a tall man in khaki with mirrored sunglasses, raises his voice. "Welcome to Camp Swift, follow the lines." "No trouble, no problems." The Germans shuffle forward, boots crunching on red dust. No one shouts at them. No one hits them. The heat is unbearable, and one of the prisoners, barely 19, nearly collapses. An American soldier rushes over, not to beat him, but to hand him a canteen. The water is cool. Real water. Inside the processing tent, each man is searched, tagged, and issued clean uniforms stamped PW. They're fingerprinted and questioned politely. Hey, Sergeant, with a southern drawl, jokes to another soldier. They look like they've seen ghosts. That night, Karl lies on a real mattress for the first time in months. Through the screened window, he hears the sound of cicadas and a harmonica playing somewhere in the dark. He doesn't know it yet, but his entire understanding of the war and of America is about to collapse. The next morning, at dawn, the guards call them to the mess hall. Stainless trays slide down the counter one after another. Scrambled eggs, bread with butter, milk, coffee, and meat. Thick slices of beefsteak sizzling under the kitchen lamps. Karl stares at his plate. He hasn't seen meat like this since before the war. A corporal beside him mutters, "They're mocking us." Another whispers, "They're fattening us before they shoot us." But when they eat, nothing happens. No trick, no poison. Just food. For the first time since capture, silence fills the hall, not out of fear but disbelief. Later that afternoon, an American lieutenant visits their barracks. Through an interpreter, he explains the Geneva Convention, that POWs must be treated humanely, that they can write home, work for pay, and receive medical care. Karl can hardly process it. In the Reich, propaganda posters had shown Americans as monsters, black and Jewish hordes corrupting the world. Yet here, in this strange sun-baked land, the enemy was feeding them better than their own army had. That night, a guard named Tom Henderson leans against the fence and smokes. He offers Karl a cigarette through the wire. For a moment, both men just stand there, two soldiers from opposite worlds sharing silence and tobacco under the Texas moon. "Don't try to run," Tom says softly. "You'll find nothing but desert for miles," Karl nods. "I won't," he replies in broken English. This already feels like another world, and in a way it was. By June 1944, Camp Swift was home to more than 10,000 German prisoners. The days followed a strange rhythm: roll call, work details, mail, then long afternoons of crushing Texas heat. Yet for many, the shock hadn't worn off. Karl Brenner had been transferred to the camp's kitchen unit, where POWs helped American cooks prepare meals. That's when he realized something truly unbelievable. They were eating the same food as the U.S. soldiers. "Steak again," muttered Corporal Weiss one noon as he sliced into the thick slab of meat on his tray. The Americans had served roast beef, green beans, mashed potatoes, and, unthinkably, vanilla ice cream. Karl watched through the serving window. The Americans joked and laughed as they worked, the aroma of grilled beef mixing with the metallic hum of ceiling fans. Everything seemed so casual, so human. He remembered Berlin radio broadcasts warning that captured Germans would be tortured or starved. Now he was standing in a line where a smiling American sergeant asked, "How do you like it? Medium or well done?" The first spoonful of ice cream sent a cold shock through his body. He hadn't tasted anything like it in years. All around him, men who had once shouted, "Heil Hitler!" in the desert now sat in stunned silence, quietly eating like guests at a family dinner. That evening, letters were distributed. They were allowed to write home. Karl hesitated over his first words. "Dear Mutter," he began, "you will not believe what America is like." Some prisoners refused to accept the truth. To them, this was a trick, psychological warfare meant to weaken their spirit. A few die-hard Nazis whispered that hidden cameras watched their every move, that kindness was just another weapon. But for most, the illusion of the barbaric American was fading fast. The camp even had a small library and classes in English. On Sundays, German chaplains held services. Prisoners could form orchestras, soccer teams, even theater troupes. The U.S. Army believed that occupied minds were peaceful minds, and it worked. One scorching July afternoon, a young private named Joe Ramirez, who had fought in North Africa, walked past the recreation yard. The sight stopped him cold. German soldiers, his former enemies, were laughing over a soccer match cheered on by American guards. For a moment, he wasn't sure who was supposed to be the prisoner. Inside the barracks that night, Karl spoke quietly to his bunkmate. "What if we were lied to?" he asked. Weiss looked up from his cot. "About what?" "About everything," Karl said. "The Americans, the war, maybe even why we fight." For the first time, doubt crept in, not as an act of betrayal, but as a sign of awakening. The propaganda that had once fueled their hatred couldn't survive the simple kindness of a meal shared in peace. And yet, beyond those fences, the world still burned. In Normandy, the Allies were landing. In Germany, cities were reduced to ash. But here in the heart of Texas, thousands of enemies sat under the same sun, eating steak and ice cream, wondering how the world could be so cruel and so kind at once. By late 1944, the prisoners at Camp Swift had settled into a rhythm that felt disturbingly close to normal life. Work in the cotton fields during the morning, a lunch of beans and cornbread, sometimes even fried chicken. The Americans paid them in canteen coupons, and many spent their earnings on cigarettes, soap, or postcards to send home. Karl Brenner had begun working alongside an American farmer named Mr. Thompson, whose ranch lay just beyond the perimeter. The army rented out POW labor to help with harvests, and every morning, a truckload of Germans was escorted down a dusty road to pick cotton under the blazing Texas sun. At first, Thompson had been wary. His son was fighting in France, and he didn't much care for the idea of feeding Nazis. But as the days passed, his attitude changed. Karl worked hard, always polite, and his broken English amused the old man. "You ain't like what I pictured," Thompson said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. Karl smiled. "We think same of you." They laughed together, the sound carrying over the rustle of dry leaves. In the evenings, when the work detail returned to camp, the guards sometimes shared stories. Many of them were farm boys, too, drafted into a war they didn't fully understand. There were jokes, music, and on rare nights, the faint melody of a harmonica drifting across the wire. The war seemed to shrink here, reduced to men simply existing, tired, sunburned, and human. But there were moments when reality returned like a storm. One night, news reached the camp. A German POW had been shot in Louisiana after trying to escape. Another rumor spread that Allied bombers had destroyed parts of Hamburg, killing thousands. Some men cried quietly in their bunks. Others clenched their fists in silence. Karl received a letter from his mother weeks later. The envelope was worn, the ink smudged. She wrote of shortages, of the cold, of the fear that had settled over their neighborhood. "The radio says America is weak," she wrote. "But if that is true, why do they feed you?" Karl didn't know how to answer. A few days later, he and a handful of prisoners were assigned to help build a new mess hall. Working beside American carpenters, Karl noticed something strange. The Americans argued freely with their officers. They complained, they joked, they even called their sergeants by name. No one was beaten. No one was shouted down. It was to him an alien kind of freedom. In the corner of the worksite, an American radio played swing music. The sound of Benny Goodman's clarinet filled the air. One guard began tapping his foot. Another whistled, and for a brief moment, Karl forgot he was a prisoner. He was just a man with a hammer in his hand, listening to a song that crossed all boundaries. That night, the camp served ice cream again, this time with chocolate syrup. Weiss grinned at him from across the table. "Maybe we lost the war," he said, "but we found heaven in Texas." They laughed, but behind the humor was a quiet ache. Because deep down they all knew that one day this strange peace would end. And when it did, they'd have to return to a homeland they no longer recognized, carrying with them the memory of the enemy who treated them like men. Spring 1945, the war was ending. Across Europe, the Reich was collapsing in on itself. Berlin surrounded. Hitler's speeches reduced to static on fading radios. In Camp Swift, the news came not through gunfire but through whispers. Guards smiled more. Rations improved. And one morning, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. Germany has surrendered. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was still, hot and heavy with disbelief. Then the realization struck. The war was over. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in silence, staring at their hands, unsure what came next. Karl Brenner stood by the wire fence, eyes fixed on the horizon. For years he had dreamed of going home. But now home was a question mark. In the following weeks, American officers explained the process of repatriation. It would take months. Transport ships were limited and Europe lay in ruins. In the meantime, the prisoners would continue their work details. Strangely, the mood inside Camp Swift softened even more. The guards and prisoners began to talk openly. A few Americans even shared photographs, wives, children, homes back in Ohio or Kansas. The Germans showed their own family photos, creased and yellow from war. The faces in those pictures weren't enemies. They were just people waiting for peace. In May, Karl helped pack up supplies in the kitchen for shipment overseas. The head cook, Sergeant Miller, clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll be head chef someday, Brenner," he said with a grin. Karl smiled faintly. "If there are kitchens left," he replied. A few days later, something extraordinary happened. The camp organized a farewell dinner, not just for officers, but for everyone. The tables were lined with white cloth, and the kitchen worked all day. When the bell rang, hundreds of German POWs filed in. On each tray, steak, potatoes, vegetables, and a final scoop of ice cream. As they ate, Karl looked around the hall. Men who had once fought and killed one another now shared laughter, trading bits of English and German. The war outside had divided nations, but within these fences, it had revealed something deeper, a shared hunger for dignity, for decency, for the taste of humanity itself. When Karl finally left Texas, it was autumn. The bus that took them to the port rolled past cotton fields now empty after harvest. The guards waved. Some of the prisoners waved back, on the ship. As the coastline disappeared into the haze, Karl wrote one last letter to his mother. "America was not what we were told. They fed us when they didn't have to. They treated us like men, not monsters. If I ever live long enough to tell my son about the war, I will tell him that even in the darkest time, there were still people who remembered what it meant to be human." He folded the letter, sealed it, and slipped it into his coat pocket. The sea stretched endlessly before him, blue, vast and quiet, and somewhere behind him in Texas, the sound of a mess hall door closed for the last time.